Morning all, let's have a look at the amazing clash yesterday between Magnus Carlsen and Levon Aronian in the last round of the Sinquefield Cup. So Magnus just needed a draw actually to win the tournament, so he kicked off with e4 and Levon chose e5. We had the classical lopez, very familiar moves, beaten territory. So vast lopez theory, but here is an interesting move, a4. Okay, let's have a quick look at live book here. The most common move is c3 with 4,109 games, h3 with 1843 games. Now a4 is quite popular, 1667. It's a way of avoiding the dreaded martial gambit, which although may not be offering winning chances for black, can often come to the draw with black. It's a very viable and respected gambit, in effect, the martial gambit, so respected that grandmasters avoid it like the plague, it seems. So a4, an anti-martial system. Okay, Levon tries b4 here. Now b4 is the second most popular with 581 games. Actually bishop b7, 999 games, is the most popular in my live book. There's also rook b8, very rare bird, 70 games. So bishop b7 is actually the top move, though, but b4 is another move. So we see b4 slightly weakens the light square grip. In particular, this c4 square. Can white make use of this c4 square later if black pawns are on dark squares? Okay, so we see now white usually plays d3 in this position. Perhaps there's a sort of barricade to a potential bishop on this diagonal, but actually Magnus tries d4, which is 141 games with d4. This is 372 games with d3, so slightly unusual to play d4 here. The reply d6 is bog standard, that's the most played move here. Okay, and then Magnus just takes on e5. And now Levon took on e5 with the pawn. Actually taking the knight is about the same level of popularity, 61 games with taking with the knight, taking with the pawn 59 games. They're both supposed to be about equal, these positions. So what's happened here? Well, now Magnus takes the queens off, so it is consistent with playing for a draw, but the question is white's position a little bit on the passive side? One thing about this position, black has got, with this pawn here, kind of suppressing white from playing c3, and you might think the d4 square is quite good for black in this position. And what about bishop c5? And generally, f2 might be vulnerable, but of course you could argue the same thing for this diagonal. Well, let's see. In the game now, actually bishop g5 has been played a lot, 23 games. Magnus plays knight bd2, which is 20 games has seen this knight bd2. Now the knight might be heading for c4 here to put pressure on h6. So h6 now, and we're coming out of theory, so let's add a kubitsa in this position. The light square pawn is fixed here with a5. Now this is a vulnerable pawn, though, from the black perspective, if black could gang up on the a5 pawn. Now one question, if black is going to win that pawn, is even if he does win that pawn, white's got this a file, there'd be pressure on a6. Would black be tangled up if he did try and win this? Well, okay, bishop c5 for the moment, and it does look rather dangerous on this diagonal. And you might think, well, can white play the same as black, to stop any knight g5s? Because knight g4 seems to be quite dangerous here. Magnus actually doesn't bother with something like h3. I think h3 might actually be quite bad. Let's see. If h3, then okay, bishop b7. Maybe it's okay as well. He didn't want to weaken his king side at all. The rook is prepared though for rook e2 in the event of knight g4. We see actually in this position after bishop c5, we see actually the move bishop c4. Okay, and it just allows knight g4, knowing that, okay, rook e2. The question is this passive though for the rook to be defending f2 like this? So rook e2, so an interesting difference on the handling of f2 and f7 already is demonstrated in this position. Levon's afforded that h6, which in the future might give the king a useful square as well. So white's back row might be a little bit vulnerable at the moment, potentially as well. Okay, but now the position goes even more dynamic. Levon Aronian doesn't mind accepting double pawns. He plays actually bishop e6. Now this does solve positionally in a radical way that slight weakness on the light square, the d5 square. There's a slight vulnerability. Okay, and the bishop was tying down a rook for a6 here. So this is an interesting question. Is it very useful to have these double pawns in this particular position? I think the answer is on the detailed nuances of the position, and Magnus does take on e6, f takes e6. Now double pawns in the centre are usually quite good. They're controlling a lot of central squares, and here also the f file might be dangerous potentially as well. So okay, h3 kicking the knight back to f6, and now the back row is still looking a bit vulnerable to rook d1 check, a natural move like knight c4 that doesn't look too good in the light of rook d1 check. In fact, this is reminiscent of a kind of game Annan lost to Adams recently. Okay, so this pressure is not to be underestimated. So we have the very cautious move rook e1. So an imbalance in the pawn structure keeps the position relatively interesting, and this is important for Levon if he wants to try and win this game. Okay, and Magnus of course wants a draw to win the tournament. So rook ab8, and it looks as though now, with black solving that problem of the pressure on a6, not only that, the b5 square can be used for the rook to come in to attack a5. So is Magnus going to lose his a5 pawn here? Knight c4? In fact he is. It looks as though that a5 pawn is under big trouble now. All it needs is a little bit more attack on a5 and it will drop. But how exactly? Okay, let's see. b3, securing the knight on c4 for a moment and preparing bishop b2, but it's black's turn. Bishop d4 preventing bishop b2, or at least bishop b2 now gives black the option of swapping off. Now rook c5. Okay, rook a2 is played in this position. This is interesting stuff. What is actually happening here? This looks very, very passive for white after rook a2. What was black actually threatening? If we just go step back for a moment, black has actually got a very concrete threat of rook takes c4 here to win material, taking the bishop on b2 after. So a very concrete threat was addressed with rook a2 protecting against rook takes c4. So even though the position doesn't seem that complex, rook c5 had a major point to it. It wasn't just about crashing down potentially to c2. And in this manner now, with bishop takes b2, white is looking vulnerable. That a5 pawn is looking very, very vulnerable now. Now knight takes b2 is out of the question because of rook takes c2. So that is the more fundamental point of the rook being on c5. So Magnus is forced to play rook takes b2. The position looks awfully passive in some respects. Can black not just take the pawn here? Maybe it's a little bit dangerous in this position because of e5. That's the problem. e5 is under fire. So if knight takes a5, knight c takes e5, and white is doing very nicely here indeed, and can look forward to ganging up some pressure on the a file. So okay, in this position, Levon plays knight e8. Where is the knight heading? It's heading for potentially d6. If you can get rid of this knight, putting pressure on e5, then this a5 will be under fire again without losing e5. Rook a2, knight d6. So it's all about a5, remarkably, this game at the moment. So knight fd2 is played here. Is this one of the only moves? I believe it's the engine's top choice, just to keep a knight on c4 in this position. Okay, so knight b7 ganging up again on a5. Three things now firing down on a5. Knight f3. Okay, again, this question here, is black able to do something like take on a5? In fact, if we just rewind, forget about the materialistic concerns, because let's just have a look at this position where white's just played knight fd2. Maybe there's another plan here, like knight d4. Is this any good for black? It looks very tempting to play knight d4, a very centralised, powerful knight, just ignoring, letting white off the a5 pawn and just going for positional pressure. This is also looking like a very, very nice position. You can't imagine black actually losing this position. Perhaps, you know, he's going for this pawn, but it's like a double-edged sword to win that pawn, because there's going to be pressure on the a file after, whilst this position looks very, very dominant for Levon. An engine suggestion is even g5 here. And, you know, how is black's entrenchment of the knights actually stopped here? This looks a wonderfully entrenched position, at least enough for a draw. So perhaps the idea of going for the pawn is wanting to go for the win, you know, with knight b7. He's signaling, you know, he's going for a win here of a pawn potentially. Okay, so that, you know, Magnus steps back with his knight, keeping that pressure on e5. So king f7, king f1. Now king f6 protecting e5, which means that a5 is really going to drop without any e5 problem at all. So rook a4, and now black is going a pawn up. Knight b takes a5, but is this enough to win this position? And not only it's a pawn, it's putting pressure on c4, of course, and underneath that is c2, but now Magnus replies knight e3, protecting c2. And white can actually double now rooks. This is why this is a bit of a double-edged sword to win this pawn on a5. This could backfire with white crashing down on the a file potentially if black's not careful. Has white got any other significant threats? Okay, let's see. We see h5, rook e1, just building that pressure on the a file. And here we see a very technical move played at move 30, believe it or not. I wonder if you can guess it. It's quite a spectacular move in the circumstances. If I gave you 10 seconds starting from now, what would you play with black? Okay, Levon offers a whole exchange sacrifice, rook d4. Can this be taken? Well, if knight takes d4, well, otherwise e4 is under great fire here. There's a lot of pressure here. So knight takes d4. If this is taken as an example, it wasn't in the game, but where does the knight go back here? You see h5 had stopped knight g4, so it wasn't just gaining space, it was actually stopping the knight g4 check, for example. The knight c4 seems quite unpalatable here because of knight takes and losing this pawn and c2 under fire. This looks quite unpleasant indeed, this sort of position. Black has now two passed pawns here. The evaluation is very, very nice, and the king coming to e5, it looks wonderful compensation for being exchanged down, but Magnus didn't have any of that. In this position, Magnus calmly played, cool as a cucumber, knight e1. So what's the idea of knight e1? He's offering e4. He's fighting dynamic moves with dynamic moves himself. What happens if rook takes e4 here? Let's have a quick look. This wasn't played. Knight d3 puts pressure on b4 and attacks the rook. And if the rook moves, let's move the rook to say b5. Then in this position, white has actually got a very, very powerful move indeed, exploiting the loose rook here with c4. This is actually winning material in this position, because if we move the rook backwards, rook takes a5, surely is quite good. There's also knight c5 is also a good move. And if b takes c3 in this position, then rook takes e4, winning that rook. And this should be okay for white, even though there's a dangerous c-pawn. This gets a little bit scary with this dangerous c-pawn. But white should have enough here to have an advantage. It is getting to very scary proportions. But an engine point of view, this is okay for white. Pardon me. Okay, so this is very, very interesting that in this position what's happened here with rook takes e4, knight d3 is dangerous for black, it seems, and this must have consumed quite a bit of time factoring in the complications of this. So okay, if that pawn's immune, now after king e7, Magnus is delightfully reinforcing his centre now with f3. So he's still going to be centralising a knight, even though he's a pawn down. These rooks look, quite ideal, and the knights are centralising, next to each other in the centre potentially, rather prettily. But this is interrupted now with rook d2. So can a knight dare to go to d3 here, or is there another powerful exchange sacrifice with rook takes c2 or something? Let's examine this. In the game, actually, we see rook d1. But let's examine knight d3. Is this just asking for another exchange sacrifice? Yes, it is a very strong move in this position. If you were black in this position, what would be a good way of sacking the exchange? If I gave you 10 seconds starting from now. Okay, apparently rook takes d3 is powerful. I don't think rook takes c2 is as good, because white could take and then take on a5. The idea is just to rook takes d3 here, and then to get that knight out of trouble with knight takes b3, and this is quite nasty. This kind of position is actually better for black. So these opportunities to sacrifice the exchange are quite fascinating. And obviously this one revolves around getting a5 out of trouble. So anyway, after rook d2, the natural knight d3 is prevented, so we see rook d1 instead, and at least this knight affords that to be able to try and exchange off rooks. We see rook d6. The rook just goes back now, kind of repetition, offering a draw in effect. Does Levon want to repeat and give Magnus the tournament? No, he kind of plays king d7 instead. Where is the king going? Is it going to support a5 maybe to make things a little bit better there? We see knight d1 now. Where is this knight going? To f2, to d3? Let's see. Rook d2. Now knight f2. Okay, so this is a safer approach to get to d3. King c8. The king is heading to protect these two pieces and pawn. So knight fd3, rook b5. That pawn was attacked there, and there's no significant exchange sacrifice in this position, surely, because the knight attacking the rook in this position is much better. Okay, there's nothing really going on there. So we see actually after knight d3, rook b5. So what is this rook doing on d2 though? h4 now. The rook's kind of trapped there for a moment. King b7. But is there going to be always knight takes b3? This rook is paralysing, white's defence of d3, because there's knight takes b3 potentially. Rook 1 to a2. King a7. King g1 at move 40 now. They're getting extra time at move 40. King b6. King f1. g6. King g1. It's a repetition draw in effect from Magnus. He's content just to move his king backwards and forwards here. So king c8. Where is Levon's king going now? Knight f2. Rook d8. Knight e d3. A lot of repetitions in this game. All Magnus Carlsen wanted was a draw out of this game, and black is playing for a win, a pawn up. So maybe the extra material is legitimising he's playing on and on for a win, but avoiding these repetitions. King b6, king e3, king b7. Now we see, in fact, technically in this position, white is actually technically doing very well now, believe it or not. He's reached the kind of more ideal scenario here, it seems. Controlling that c5 square has kind of trapped this rook on b5. It's just holding up a5. Look at white's rooks. And white's got a wonderfully centralised king now and centralised knight. So is white improving the position? From an engine point of view, white is up half a pawn despite being materially down half a pawn. Houdini is quite dynamic in its assessments. Why would it think white is actually better now? Well, it seems that black's position is a bit stuck over here. We see knight d1. Now, knight d1. Another move might be knight h3, engine point of view. The idea of knight g5, just improving the knights like this. Okay, but knight d1, king c8, knight 1 to b2 now. These rooks really do want to still crash down this a file. This knight's in the way, but what about this idea of knight c4 now? This is coming up to be a major threat now in this position. The pressure is being put on black, and I think at some point around here, Levon Aronian had offered a draw, and Magnus, believe it or not, shockingly had refused. If he just accepted the draw, then taking all the risk, all the uncertainty of winning the tournament would have been taken away, and apparently Magnus Carlsen played on. He refused Levon Aronian's draw offer. As a professional chess player, you know, wanting to win tournaments, most professionals in the world would just accept the draw and win the tournament. No fuss, no risk, no regret. But here, Magnus is demonstrating something else indeed. He's playing on now in this position. So rook d6, rook a1, king d8. It seems white has the threat. White has the threat of knight c4, and which he plays now, knight c4. He's crashing down the a file, temporarily accepting double pawns, but he's going to win his pawn back with advantage. What's going on here? If these rooks crash down the a file, what can black actually do in this position? All of a sudden, the pressure on a5 is under great scrutiny from the white pieces here. What can black do in this position with the rook and a5 under fire? He has to take. So temporarily, okay, double pawns, but as well as losing a6, c5 is also potentially very nice. We see rook b8, and now in this position, not taking on a6, Magnus plays the top engine move here, which is actually to play c5. He's making c6 a bit looser in advance. Okay, and it looks as though black's position is gone very bad all of a sudden here. Very bad. This rook, you know, this double pawn here, theoretically those were slight weaknesses, but it might be exposed along this 6th rank. These double pawns and this g6, these are all weaknesses along the 6th rank. Levon tries rook d7 here. In fact, it's so desperate the engines are suggesting rook takes d3 as being the best move in this position. That's how bad the position has gone here. So rook d7, rook takes a6. Why is this position now so incredibly bad? Why can't black just play knight d4, for example? Now this is utter cruelty. From black seemingly having a great position, winning that pawn on a5, let's examine the horrors behind knight d4 in this position. If knight d4, white has the crushing move, rook a8. So why is this crushing, you might ask? What on earth can black do here? If he plays king c8, then knight takes b4. And what's the threat? Taking here, and then c3, and then knight c6 looks horrible. Let's give black a move, for example, just as an example. Takes king b7, rook g8, so threatening c3 and c6 check. If rook e7, these pawns are just dropping off. Look at these pawns just dropping off. How cruel this is. The knight can be evicted. Rook h6, all the pawns are there for the taking in this position. Okay, so let's go back. So in this position, after rook takes a6, it seems knight d4, rook a8 is very, very powerful. What on earth could black do? Even worse, if he took the rook, king e7, knight takes e5, and again, this is absolutely disgusting for black. If rook d8 in this position, knight takes g6, trying to drag the king away from e8. If king e8, we can take here, and this is plus 15 for white. We just take the knight. The protection on knight's just been kicked off the board, the e5 pawn. So this is absolutely, this is why this is horrendous. This crashing down the a file is absolutely horrendous here after rook takes a6. Levon tried now this seemingly rather desperate move, b3, which is equivalent to resignation. He's losing an entire piece. He didn't want any of that stuff with rook a8. So Magnus is now going up an entire piece. A certain magic here. People looking at this broadcast and thinking, you know, Magnus is in trouble, coming back a few minutes later and he's a piece up. How on earth did this happen? This a file led to being a piece up. So anyway, so b takes c2. In shell shock maybe, or irritation, Levon's playing on a piece down now, a whole piece down. Are there any tricks here? If rook c1, which wasn't played, is there a trick? Yes, rook b3 would be a very, very nasty trick. White has to be careful, but this is Magnus Carlsen. This is the top player in the world, a piece up. He's not going to throw it all away with a blunder like that. He plays knight e1, the very, very careful move, not allowing a horrible pin. Knight e1, and now he is definitely a piece up. King e7, knight takes c2, check, king e2, rook b2, that's defended, rook a2. Black is like a headless chicken. The head's come off and the chicken's still running around. He's a piece down against Magnus Carlsen. King f6, f takes, king takes. Are there any other tricks that black can arrange here? Knight e1, check. Check. It looks as though the rooks are quite dangerous on the second rank, and can this king crash through? Or is this all will over objective reality? Rook d7. Magnus plays knight f3 check, offering the e4 pawn. Can that actually be taken? Well, e6 would drop surely if the pawn takes. If king takes, rook takes e6, and then g6, thank you very much. So the king sidesteps with king f4. Is the king trying to coordinate with both rooks now for some sort of mating net? Rook takes e6. And now another desperate looking move, g5, but trying to maybe undermine f3 now with h4 and h3. This is taken though. h4 is not even played in this position. Instead we see king g3. If h4, Magnus has just got, for example, rook h6 check, this will do. There's nothing going on here. Stopping h3. So we see Levon trying king g3 after rook f6, rook a2. Now just move knight e5, offering black the opportunity for doubling the rooks, but here black actually resigned. So why is this? Well, he is a piece down, but if rook d2, trying to coordinate the two rooks with the king, there's actually a forced mate in this position. A mate in 10, believe it or not. Now, rook f3 check is good here, but the mate in 10 is with rook c3 check. Now, if the king goes to h2, then rook h3 is mate. So if the king goes to h4, rook h3 check, king takes, rook f5 check, king h6. The rooks are coordinating with the knight over there. Rook g5 check, rook f5 check, rook h7 check, 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 and this is just an example of the forced mates which the engines see in this position, and it would end like this. So in the game anyway, after this knight e5, which does vacate this third rank for this lethal check, black actually resigned here without bothering to put both rooks on the 7th rank, which looks as though, you know, that was the whole point of getting the king here. A remarkably interesting game. by both sides, and shows the great psychology and the pressure and the role of material in that. It creates maybe sometimes a false optimism being a pawn up, but Magnus, he realised his position contained, very, very powerful threats based on that a4, and he carried on. Even though he just needed a draw, he refused the draw and he carried on. So he won this tournament and has now got a FIDE rating on the live ratings of 2870, I believe. He's back to 2870. A fantastic game, and congratulations to Magnus Carlsen for finishing the tournament in style in the Sinquefield Cup. Comments or questions on YouTube? Thanks very much.